Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. This month, citizens of the United States celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. Many Catholics who love both God and country will resonate with the words of Father Richard John Newhouse in his last book. In it, he wrote, "When I meet God, I expect to meet him as an American." Now, he was quick to clarify this was not the most important aspect of his being. Anyone who's read his writings will know this well. But that he nevertheless would face God as someone who tried to take seriously and tried to take others to take seriously the story of America within the story of the world. Other Catholics read these lines about taking the story of America seriously within the story of the world and think them idolatrous. Why should people care about America's place in the story of the world? David Deavel joins us. David Paul Deavel, a dear friend of mine, Associate Professor of Theology at University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, senior contributor at the Imaginative Conservative. He's also a prolific author, and so I've come to suspect that David never sleeps. David, thank you for joining us, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Marcus.
Always a joy, and thank you for penning this piece in Catholic World Report. You echo so many sentiments that I myself have, and so I want to begin by asking you to speak to the fact that as Catholics, we have so much to reflect on and also be grateful for as we've just hit the quote-unquote semi-quincentennial $50 word of the year.
Yes, I think that, sometimes people have a completely bleak view of how everything is going in America and, all of the difficulties with various politicians and corporations and everything stacked against us. But the key thing is to always begin with gratitude. And we have to admit that America has been a good place in many ways for Catholics to be, and many of our problems have been failing to take seriously our own roles in praying for and working for the good of this country, because it's been very good for Catholics.
I thank you for saying that, and I want to invite you to speak to that just a little more so that we as Catholics can appreciate it and understand that deeper, that there's so much about the way this nation is founded and the way it is right now that has been good for the flourishing of the Catholic Church in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you think about even at the beginnings of this nation, when they were writing to figure out who would be our first bishop, and it turned out that it was going to be John Carroll, cousin of Charles Carroll, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. Many Catholics wrote and said, what does the government say on who should be a bishop? Basically, the U.S. government was, well, we don't decide that sort of thing here. And that actually is something that had been fought for in many corners of Christendom for centuries, the independence of the church to make bishops and to make priests, not according to whatever the political sentiment was or according to somebody else's choice, but according to the choice of those who had been anointed by God as bishops and popes in the Catholic Church. So even that very one thing, that we didn't have something that many ostensibly Catholic countries had, the freedom to have our bishops chosen not by government but by the church, is something that has been very powerful for this nation.
I want to invite you to speak, David, to one of the misunderstandings modern Catholics might have, that the way in which we have the liberty for the church's flourishing might actually be a bad thing, and that what's desirable is an autocratic kind of a Catholic theocracy that would be best. Just share your wisdom in sort of recalibrating our thinking with the blessing we have been given.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look back to the 19th century and some of the papal enunciations back then, and some of the common views that, the best situation is a kind of a state in which the church and the government are united. And while there's certainly truth that we need to have some sort of a substantial underpinning of our country, that direct union isn't necessarily such a good thing, because what happens is that if you are doing something that the government doesn't like, they can take away the rights of you to act. Whereas, the Catholic Church has been fairly free to do what she needs to do in this country, not without attempts at sort of pinning her down on questions of education or anything like that. But largely, we've been freer in many ways than many of those, ostensibly Catholic countries in which it was a Catholic state. One of the things about, the crazy part of the 60s is that when things were going wild, there were certainly problems in the Catholic Church in the United States, but in places where there was that strong, tight-knit union, such as Quebec or Ireland, secularism set in fairly quickly. And people who resented their government then blamed the church for it. And we haven't really had that. And that's been a good thing.
I'm so grateful that you're sharing that, because what that also highlights is if we are honest and diligent students of history, we'll be the first to admit that there's never been an idyllic form of government that has worked perfectly for the flourishing of the Catholic faith. That's
right. The late theologian at Boston College, I'm forgetting his name, Ernest Fortin. Thank you. He's an Augustinian. He used to talk about the church as being transpolitical. And of course, we hear trans and we think something else. But what he meant by that is that the church has never accepted that there is simply one way of doing things politically or doing things in terms of government. And that's something that even Leo XIII admitted, that one form of government is like another. They are all flawed, and the church has to work in whatever circumstances she finds herself. And it's possible to do what God wants us to do in almost any form of government that's halfway decent.
If we understand that rightly, then perhaps we can get a sense of what Father Richard John Newhouse meant when he talked about meeting God as an American. And, you rightly highlight this, and I'm really glad for it, but we can also admit it sounds almost idolatrous to someone from the outset if they don't have the context.
Yeah. But I do think that, right, I mean, we will meet God as people, in our judgment, as people from a particular situation. Mm-hmm. And the goods that we've been given in our family, our local community, and indeed our nation, those are going to be the context for which we are going to be judged. How is it that we served the people around us? Have we responded as Jeremiah told the people of Israel who had been exiled to Babylon that, they were to seek the good of the city in which they were? Have we sought the good of this earthly city or not? And I think that's definitely going to be something that we're going to have to face God with. How did we use our talent and our treasure for the church's good, but also for the place in which we lived?
If we can think of that rightly and consider that rightly, what we can also say is our context, especially here in the United States, greatly determines how we ought to respond in our possession of the fullness of the faith. And so being a Catholic American brings with it a particular moral onus that we will be held to judgment for.
I think that's right. I mean, a lot of people talk about Leo XIII also talked about, Americanism as a kind of heresy, and that's sort of thinking that America alone has, all wisdom, or deferring to on questions of ultimate concern. We can fall into that, but we can also fall into other errors. What we really are called to do is to actually encourage what is good here in the earthly city and indeed in our earthly nation, and we also should seek to correct the errors that we find here. But we should always trust that it's God who has placed us in this situation, and that He wants us to do the best that we can to follow His will for all around us.
My guest is Dr. David Paul Deavel, Associate Professor of Theology at University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and we're talking about, essentially being Catholic Americans and being grateful for the United States, but also understanding there's a tremendous amount of work we have to do. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Mark Speed and talking with Dr. David Paul Deavel, Associate Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. David, we were talking earlier about the responsibility that being in a republic like the United States puts on the shoulders of Catholic Americans. And for the sake of our listeners, I want to provide context here. Every Catholic born into whatever political milieu has certain social responsibilities, and therefore ours is particularly unique. I invite your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people really shrink back from taking that responsibility. I think there's a basic human flaw that many of us want to shrink back from our duties and not take responsibility. And many approach this as, well, it's the government's fault. They're giving us something bad. But in a republic in which, all right, our government does give us some capacity to make our consent to be governed and to actually have a say, we have a greater responsibility. And it's simply not acceptable to just simply complain and not do the best that we can to make sure that our government functions in a way that comports with the natural law and does all these, basically does the things that a government should do. And I think that it's a real problem that people want to just simply be led around rather than to be represented and to have their voice heard, when that's what the church has always called us to do, because that's the way that we seek the good of our city.
Why do we do that? What happened to us? If you take a look at history, it would appear that Christians from the earliest histories understood that, and somehow we let that very fundamental fact fall by the wayside.
Yeah, I think some of it is basically human weakness, that people shrink back from doing the good because it's difficult. That's why we require, courage, and particularly since that unfortunate the garden, as Father Newhouse used to say. But I think there's also a modern aspect of this, which is with our own need, with our own entertainment. And I think it's very difficult for us to actually get ourselves together and say, let's actually do the work that needs to be done. And the downside of this is that many times it's the forces, who have a very bad notion of what our country needs, who are willing to take that time. Oscar Wilde said that the problem with being a socialist is that it takes up too many free evenings. And I understand that, but we do need to be able to sacrifice some of our time in order that our voice is heard, so that we don't become run by the socialists.
So, just so that you brought up a few crucial things that I think we ought to pay attention to. But I think in particular, like you rightly mentioned, there are those who have weaponized themselves for the sake of social activism causes, and they tend to be the loudest voices that do the most or cause the biggest amount of action. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're doing what's best for society and therefore for the flourishing of the common good.
That's right. It's a problem that many times those who are interested in leading or representing often are not very clued into what that really means, or what are the best ways of doing these jobs. But this is a problem, right? Is that for those of us who do feel like we do have a good understanding of what is required, we do have to actually make sacrifices to do those things. And that's a general problem today. Many people do not want to volunteer their time, at any level. We are too caught up in our own private activities and oftentimes merely being entertained. And so I do think it's a problem that, I'm glad that people want to be involved in activism and doing things. But when we have nobody who has the right idea out there, right, the bad side is going to win, or the imprudent side is going to win.
We also want to be cautious that you and I are not trying to say that America is already what Christ would call the city on a hill. In fact, John Winthrop's famous sermon has more to do with the aspiration that we will become that. And so is that what you're urging us toward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's this is why I think Father Newhouse's reference to America as Babylon is actually very useful. Was Babylon the model of the heavenly city? Well, not exactly, but it's where we are right now, and we need to work for the good of that city, which means working to change it. And the goal is to make it a good earthly city that will, in fact, become much more like Jerusalem, our mother above.
Understanding that we will never get a Catholic utopia in this life because our kingdom, like Christ's, is not of this world. Thanks be to God for that.
Yeah, the problem is that many people who go into this business of activism and politics with the idea that they're going to create a heaven on earth, they soon discover, only too late, that what you've created is something that's a hell. Catholic teaching is not that we can create a perfect and spotless society, but what we can do is we can create a good society in which basic justice is done and community is capable of being made, in which people can actually discover the truth about the nature of the human person and be led to understand that actually that truth goes way deeper than we can get through politics, that there is something bigger at stake. But we can never consider that this world is the final end, because it can only ever be a faint shadow of what is to come. And yet we still have to work to make it as good as we can.
Which raises two crucial things. On the one hand, our Catholic engagement in society and politics is to try to bring about the ideals and the call of the gospel, and therefore heavenly ideals on earth. But on the other hand, we've seen history show us what happens when you take it too far. In fact, socialism and communism are examples of exactly that.
That's right. I mean, I do think that there's sometimes you'll get the sort of the anti-woke, anti-religious figures saying, well, wokeness is a form of religion, socialism is a form of religion. And, many of them think, well, by virtue of saying it's a religion, it's bad. And that's not true. But what is true is that Marxism and other forms of socialism are often substitute versions of a real sense of what religion is all about. But because they've taken out the heart of it, because they've cut off the branch that they're sitting on, right? All they can do is crash the thing.
Okay, that's a brilliant analogy. That truly is. And so, considering that we've just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, one of the ways in which we, as Catholics, can express gratitude is to put ourselves not just in the minds and the writings of our founders, but to understand the significant cost of life, reputation, family, and property that was involved by them for the sake of securing the liberalism and flourishing that we enjoy today.
Yeah, I think that that the famous lines about pledging our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, that just that sounds to many people very airy, but it was a real thing, right? That we have to put ourselves on the line. Like I said, many people don't even want to go to a meeting, but that's really what we need to do. Maggie Gallagher, Catholic commentator, wrote a piece about probably 10 years ago in which she said, the problem is everybody thinks that Catholics and Catholic conservatives have become too political. The problem is they're not political enough, and they don't engage themselves in going to those meetings in the evening. And there's a lot that we can do, particularly at the local level and the state level. But we shrink back from actually that hard work, putting things on the line, even just going to the meeting. And I think if we really took as and Americans, we would say, you know what, in order to seek the good of the city, I have to go to those meetings. I have to vote in this election. I have to do much more than vote, but I have to do the basics, and I have to involve myself in trying to make things better where I am and where I have the capacity to do it.
You know, you're very much like a modern Chesterton in a lot of ways, and what you just shared is perhaps one of the most Chestertonian things I've seen you do. It's not so much that Catholics are too political, it's that we're not political enough. And so with the next just about a minute left, David, I invite you to speak directly to our listeners and to exhort them. Very practical things that we have to do, not just for the sake of engaging and re-engaging the social sphere, but also purifying it, lest we lose the great blessing that we've been given in this nation.
Yeah, I think listeners out there really do need to pay attention. We like to get involved in the national scene, and that's important. Don't get me wrong. But where you have that great effect is probably going to be in your town and in your county and on your state level. Pay attention to the news that is not just about the national figures, but about the local figures, and figure out where you can step in, running for a school board position or some sort of position on your town council, or helping out any way you can. It's going to be getting involved in these things in a direct political way that you're going to find that you have a lot to offer, and that offering is not just to them, but it's to God as a sacrifice.
David, as usual, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for that very rousing call to take responsibility.
Thank you, Marcus.
My guest has been Dr. Paul Deavel, Associate Professor of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And David has very honestly encouraged all of us to wake up and realize that being Catholics in America means we have an obligation to sanctify it for the Lord. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.